She thought her secret affair was buried forever, until her own daughter stood up in church and spoke into the microphone. What the child said froze the entire congregation. A marriage collapsed in seconds. This is not just a story of cheating. It's a story of truth, shame, and redemption. The truth is stranger than fiction. Subscribe now for more stories that will leave you speechless. After the storm settled, life in Mavuno Estate never returned to what it once was. Miriam walked the streets with her head bowed, feeling eyes follow her every step. Even the children, who once greeted her cheerfully, now stared in awkward silence. Daniel kept his distance, not out of hatred, but because the wound was still fresh. Every room in the house carried memories that now hurt to recall. Praise sensed a heaviness and tried to be extra obedient. Silence became the loudest sound in their home. Daniel threw himself deeper into work, leaving early and returning late. He avoided conversations that touched emotions, fearing they would break him. Miriam noticed the way he no longer prayed aloud at home. The man who once led family devotions now sat quietly, lost in thought. At night, she heard him sigh deeply in his sleep. She wanted to reach out, but fear held her back. Love was still there, but trust had been wounded badly. Church life became another battle. Miriam stopped attending main services and joined only midweek prayers when fewer people came. Some women welcomed her with compassion, while others kept their distance. Every sermon on faithfulness felt like a direct arrow to her heart. She wrote pages of repentance prayers in her journal. Fasting became her refuge, tears her daily bread. She knew forgiveness was possible, but restoration would be slow. Praise began asking difficult questions. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy smile anymore?" she asked one evening. Miriam struggled to answer without placing guilt on the child. She hugged her tightly and said, "Daddy is healing." Praise nodded, but remained unconvinced. Children understood more than adults often realized. At school, classmates whispered things they overheard at home. Praise returned one day crying, saying someone called her mother a bad woman. That night, Miriam broke down completely. She wept until her body shook, clutching Praise tightly. Daniel heard the cries from the guest room, but stayed silent. His heart hurt for his daughter, yet anger still chained him. He blamed himself for not noticing the cracks earlier. Regret haunted him for trusting blindly. Still, seeing his child suffer pierced him deeply. Something inside him began to soften. Meanwhile, Pastor Elias struggled in a distant town. He had lost his calling, reputation, and peace. Churches refused to accept him once they learned his history. Nightmares followed him everywhere. He dreamed of the church hall, the microphone, and Praise's voice echoing endlessly. Guilt crushed him daily. He wrote countless apology letters, but tore most of them up. Shame kept him hidden. Miriam focused on rebuilding herself spiritually. She joined a counseling group for women who had fallen and risen again. Listening to others made her realize she wasn't alone. Some had lost marriages completely. Others never saw their children again. She thanked God quietly that Daniel had not taken Praise away. Hope, though faint, flickered within her. Redemption felt distant, but not impossible. Daniel eventually agreed to attend counseling sessions. At first, he sat quietly, arms crossed, saying little. Over time, words began to come. He spoke of betrayal, embarrassment, and shattered faith. The counselor reminded him that forgiveness was a process, not an event. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing peace daily. Daniel listened, torn between pain and responsibility. At home, small changes began. Daniel started greeting Miriam again, though briefly. They discussed Praise's school and basic needs. It wasn't warmth, but it was progress. Miriam treasured every small conversation. She stopped pushing for reconciliation and focused on consistency. Trust, she learned, was rebuilt quietly, brick by brick, not by force. Praise noticed the difference too. She smiled more when her parents spoke calmly. One evening, Daniel helped her with homework again. That simple act brought tears to Miriam's eyes. Hope grew slowly, like grass after fire. Pain still lingered, but hatred faded. The family wasn't healed yet, but it was no longer bleeding openly. Rumors in the community gradually cooled. New scandals replaced old ones. People moved on, as they always did. But Miriam never forgot the lessons. She avoided secrecy like poison. Every decision passed through prayer and accountability. Her humility spoke louder than words. Slowly, people began to respect her again. One Sunday, Daniel surprised everyone by returning to church with his family. Whispers followed, but no one spoke aloud. The sermon that day was about mercy. Daniel felt every word deeply. Miriam wept quietly beside him. Praise held both their hands tightly. For the first time in a long while, they felt like a family again. Time continued its quiet march, and with it came lessons no sermon could teach. Daniel became more reflective, learning that strength sometimes meant vulnerability. He stopped pretending he was fine when he wasn't. Counseling sessions peeled back layers of pride he never knew he had. Miriam listened more than she spoke, accepting correction without defense. She no longer rushed forgiveness, but respected Daniel's pace. Pain still surfaced unexpectedly, but it no longer controlled the household. Healing was becoming intentional. Praise grew into a thoughtful child shaped by experience. She learned early that adults were not perfect. Her innocence was bruised, but not broken. Daniel made it a point to speak openly with her, answering questions gently. He never blamed Miriam in front of her. Miriam, in turn, became fiercely protective of Praise's emotional health. They prayed together every night, not out of routine, but necessity. The family bond strengthened quietly. Miriam returned to work, keeping herself productive and focused. She avoided leadership roles, choosing service over spotlight. She cleaned the church quietly after services and helped where no one noticed. Some women mocked her humility, but others admired it. Her silence preached louder than excuses ever could. She learned that restoration does not demand applause. True repentance thrives in obscurity, and Miriam accepted that fully. Daniel slowly resumed his role in church, but with boundaries. He stepped away from public leadership for a season. This decision surprised many, but it was deliberate. He wanted healing more than honor. He wanted truth more than titles. The church elders respected his honesty. His humility changed how people viewed him. Brokenness made him relatable. One evening, Daniel finally asked the question that had haunted him for months. "Did you ever love him?" he asked Miriam quietly. Her breath caught, but she answered honestly. "No," she said, tears flowing. "I was lost, not in love." Daniel nodded slowly. The answer didn't erase pain, but it eased something inside him. Truth, though painful, brought clarity. Lies would have destroyed them further. Forgiveness came gradually, not dramatically. Daniel didn't wake up one day suddenly healed. Instead, he chose grace daily, sometimes hourly. Some days were easier than others. On difficult days, silence returned briefly. But resentment no longer ruled him. Forgiveness became a decision, not a feeling, and that decision brought peace. Years passed, and the scandal faded into memory. New families joined the church who knew nothing of the past. Miriam and Daniel became known for quiet kindness. Their home once again welcomed laughter. Praise thrived academically and spiritually. She grew into a confident young girl with empathy beyond her age. Pain had shaped her, but not defined her. God had redeemed what could have destroyed her. One afternoon, a young woman approached Miriam after service. She confessed she was battling temptation and secrecy. Tears streamed as she asked for guidance. Miriam listened without judgment. She shared her story honestly, without embellishment. The woman wept openly, grateful for the warning. That day, Miriam realized her pain had purpose. Her fall had become someone else's rescue. Daniel eventually shared his testimony with men struggling in marriage. He spoke about neglect, assumptions, and emotional distance. He never excused sin, but acknowledged his own blind spots. Men listened closely, moved by his honesty. His vulnerability saved marriages quietly. Pain had reshaped his leadership. He became a shepherd who understood wounds, and people trusted him again. Praise, now older, asked one evening if she had done wrong that day in church years ago. Miriam and Daniel exchanged glances. Daniel knelt beside her and held her hands. "You spoke truth," he said gently. "Truth is never wrong, even when it hurts." Praise nodded slowly, relieved. That moment released years of hidden guilt from her heart. Healing completed its circle. Far away, Pastor Elias continued his journey of repentance. He never returned to ministry. Instead, he volunteered quietly in community programs. He lived with the consequences of his choices. One day, he sent a final letter asking forgiveness again. Daniel replied with grace and closure. Forgiveness didn't restore what was lost, but it freed everyone involved. Miriam eventually wrote in her journal, one final time about the affair. She closed the book and gave it away. The past no longer needed to be rehearsed. She lived present, mindful, and accountable. Her marriage wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Honesty became their foundation, and that foundation held. On their anniversary, Daniel surprised Miriam with a simple dinner at home. No grand gestures, just sincerity. He thanked her for her patience and change. She thanked him for choosing forgiveness. They prayed together afterward, hands trembling slightly. Love returned, matured by fire. What survived the storm was stronger than before. Grace had rewritten their story. The church later used their journey anonymously in counseling materials. Not for gossip, but guidance. Lessons were drawn without names. Redemption was emphasized over shame. The congregation learned that brokenness didn't disqualify sincerity. Many lives changed because one family chose healing over bitterness. God worked quietly, powerfully. Mercy prevailed. Miriam never forgot the day her secret was exposed. But she no longer feared it. What once brought shame now brought wisdom. She taught others that secrecy destroys faster than truth. And that confession, though painful, saves lives. Her voice was gentle but firm. Her scars became credentials. And her life became testimony. Daniel often reflected on how pride blinded him before. He learned that spiritual titles don't replace emotional presence. Love requires attentiveness. Faith requires accountability. Marriage requires humility. These lessons shaped him deeply. He became a better father and husband. Brokenness refined him, and he was grateful. Praise eventually stood in the same church years later, now a teenager. She sang with confidence and clarity. Her voice filled the sanctuary. Daniel and Miriam watched proudly from the front row. Tears streamed, not from pain, but gratitude. God had restored what seemed impossible. The past no longer had power. Redemption stood before them. In the end, their story was not about infidelity alone. It was about consequences, truth, and mercy. It was about how secrets rot the soul, and how truth, though brutal, heals deeply. It was about a child's innocence speaking what adults hid, and about God using broken moments for restoration. Some stories end in destruction. Others end in redemption. This one chose redemption, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Forgiveness didn't erase scars, but it gave them meaning. And in that meaning, the family found peace. The story of Miriam's family continued to ripple quietly through lives they would never meet. Some women, inspired by whispered testimonies, chose honesty over secrecy in their own homes. Some men learned that emotional absence could be as dangerous as betrayal itself. The church slowly became a safer place for broken people, not a stage for perfection. Lessons once learned through pain turned into wisdom shared gently. Miriam never sought recognition for this impact. She understood that true influence often worked in silence. Her journey reminded many that falling did not mean failure forever. What mattered was how one rose again. Daniel grew softer with time, not weaker. He learned to speak his emotions instead of burying them under responsibility. His laughter returned, though it carried maturity instead of carelessness. He became intentional about presence, never again assuming love would survive neglect. His relationship with praise deepened through honest conversations. He taught her strength balanced with kindness. In quiet moments, he thanked God for not losing his family entirely. Gratitude replaced resentment in his heart. Praise's childhood, though marked by early pain, shaped her compassion. She became the friend others trusted with secrets. Teachers noticed her emotional intelligence beyond her years. She often prayed for families she sensed were struggling. Her innocence matured into wisdom without bitterness. Miriam watched her daughter with awe and humility. She knew praise had paid a price for her mistakes. That realization kept Miriam grounded forever. Occasionally, memories returned uninvited. A song, a sermon, or a date on the calendar stirred old emotions. When that happened, Miriam no longer hid or panicked. She talked openly with Daniel, choosing transparency every time. Silence was no longer their refuge. Communication became their protection. Pain lost its power when shared honestly. What once controlled them now simply passed through. Healing proved stronger than memory. Years later, Miriam was invited to speak at a women's retreat. She hesitated, afraid of reopening old wounds. After prayer, she accepted, guided by humility. She told her story plainly, without dramatization. The room filled with tears, not judgment. Women came forward seeking prayer and accountability. That night, chains broke quietly. Miriam returned home lighter than she had felt in years. Daniel attended that retreat's final session quietly. He watched from the back, observing how far they had come. Pride tried to rise, but gratitude overtook it. He realized forgiveness had healed him as much as it healed Miriam. Letting go had freed his spirit. Holding on to anger would have destroyed him. That truth humbled him deeply. Love, he learned, required courage. The church itself changed over time. Leadership emphasized accountability instead of image. Counseling became mandatory for those in authority. Transparency replaced fear-based silence. Scandals decreased, not because people became perfect, but because they became honest. Broken leaders stepped down early instead of hiding. The congregation matured emotionally. Pain had taught them wisdom. Growth followed humility. Miriam and Daniel never claimed their marriage was flawless. They acknowledged its scars openly, but those scars became reminders of survival. They celebrated anniversaries not with extravagance, but gratitude. Every year felt like a gift, not an entitlement. Love matured into partnership. Romance became intentional, not assumed. Faith became lived, not performed. Peace became their greatest treasure. As time passed, their story slowly faded from public memory. But within their home, lessons remained alive. Truth was spoken gently, but firmly. Secrets were not allowed to grow. Prayer was honest, not theatrical. Accountability was mutual. Love was intentional. Forgiveness was practiced daily. Grace defined their household. In the quiet of one ordinary evening, Miriam reflected on her journey. She realized the worst day of her life had become the doorway to her greatest transformation. Shame had lost its voice. Fear no longer ruled her decisions. God had turned exposure into deliverance. Brokenness had produced wisdom. Love had survived fire. And in that realization, she smiled, truly free at last.